Hi, guys. This is chapter 14, Season of Secrets and Surprises. Listen to this. Can you see this? Can you see my screen?
Springerle.
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 Can you see that? That is what should be your second vocab word. So it's Springerle. And I forgot the R. Springerle. Let's listen to it again.
Springerle.
It's well, we can see what it is. It is a German Christmas cookie. Okay, so that's a German Christmas cookie. Then you have Pfeffernuss, which is another food something. You can look that up, Pfeffernuss, and chloroform. Chloroform is a poison that you'll see. Okay, and then when you read it, you're going to list all the things found in Mrs. Dowdle's kitchen. Lots of things. And then what does Bobby mean at the end of the chapter when he says, if something had been coming, I wouldn't be able to tell. If something had been coming, I wouldn't be telling this. So if something had been coming, I wouldn't be telling this. I wouldn't be telling this story of something. That's kind of what that means, I think. And then there's, what did Bobby, Mrs. Dowdle, and Mrs. Wilcox do? So what were they doing? They were stealing something. I'll give you that hint before we even... Mrs. Dowdle was having Bobby help her steal something. But for a good cause, as usual, because she's awesome. Okay, chapter 14, Season of Secrets and Surprises. On the subject of Christmas, Mrs. Dowdle made herself clear. It was just another day as far as she was concerned, and she meant to do very little about it this year. On the other hand, her Monarch stove hadn't cooled since Thanksgiving. Her kitchen was stacked to the ceiling with black walnut fudge, this is what you're listing, candied orange peel, Litzer torts, sugar cookies in shapes, Pfeffernuss, gingerbread people, Springerle, whatever that was, brandy snaps, heavenly hash, popcorn balls, glazed chestnuts, and some 50 pounds of peanut brittle rolled out on a marble top from one of her front room tables. Also, she'd ordered a turkey from the IGA store. There in front of the IGA, the veterans of foreign wars were selling Christmas trees. Mrs. Dowdle was on hand when they opened for business. Several witnesses lingered to observe the rare sight of her shopping for anything. And several reported how she gave each and every tree a good shake to see how dry its needles were. Also, she had badmouthed several. A new thing for the Christmas of 1958 was trees sprayed white. One of them was sprayed in a pink that would have shamed Phyllis's bedroom walls. Witnesses reported that Mrs. Dowdle staggered back in her gum boots when she came to the pink one. The only tree of any interest to her was a blue spruce 9 foot tall. She grabbed it by the neck, shook the living daylights out of it, and seemed to approve. But when she heard they wanted 2 1/4 for it, she erupted like Mount Vesuvius. I only want 1 tree, she was heard to thunder, not the whole grove. Everybody in town figured she could afford any tree on the lot with what she earned off the roadside stand in the time of the Kickapoo Princess. But it hurt Mrs. Dowdle's feelings to spend money. I'd heard her say many a time that she had short arms and long pockets. When Mrs. Milton Grider asked her why she wouldn't settle for the tabletop tree in the 75-cent range, she said she wanted a good big one to fill up her bay window to light the way for his coming. And whether she meant the Christ child or somebody else, no witness knew. Ruth Ann thought she knew. We were seeing a little more of Ruth Ann these days. With the Christmas baking behind them, Mrs. Dowdle was shooing her home, sometimes before dark. Mrs. Dowdle was full of surprises. But then Christmas is the season of secrets and surprises. It sure was around here. Ruth Ann was somewhat sulky. Mrs. Dowdle says we have better have our chimney swept, and we don't even have a fireplace. Ruth Ann twitched. And she's going to have a big tree lit up in her bay window to show him the way. She's just trying to pull the wool over my eyes. Ruth Ann's grown-up front teeth were about halfway in now. She didn't whistle and spit so much when she talked. Mother was grooming her for a solo in the choir concert. Why do you think Mrs. Dowdle is trying to pull the wool over your eyes? Dad asked. Ruth Ann slumped. She thinks I'm nothing but a little kid. I'm practically halfway through the 1st grade, and she doesn't even notice. You can say, and she don't even notice. She doesn't notice, Mother corrected. You can say that again, Ruth Ann said. She thinks I'm worried he'll be looking for me in Terre Haute, not here. It was just the 4 of us at the table. Phyllis was upstairs writing a letter to either Elvis or Roscoe. Who, honey? Dad asked. You know who, Daddy. Santa, Ruth spelled. Claus. The kitchen clock ticked loud in the silence. I haven't believed since the first month of school. She drew up her small shoulders to shrug off Santa Claus. Word gets around. Mother and Dad looked a little sorry. Ruth Ann had been the last Santa believer among us, and now... But, honey, are you sure? Dad said. What about leaving out cookies for Santa's treat? Daddy, you ate the cookies. Well, what about reindeer on the roof? Please, Daddy, how do you think they got up there? Honey, don't you want to hang up your stocking on Christmas Eve? It was Dad's last offer. Ruth Ann pondered. She pulled on more chins than she had. She really was a miniature Mrs. Dowdle. At least with her teeth coming in, she looked a little less like Mrs. Wilcox. I hadn't thought about the stocking, she said. But I'm not a baby anymore. She poked invisible specks back in her nose. In many important ways, I'm practically 10. But Grachel was there in her lap without the doll buggy. Grachel never got out now. But she rarely missed a meal. Ruth Ann was holding her up so she could look one-eyed across the oilcloth and see everything. As it turned out, Mrs. Dowdle got her Christmas tree and didn't cost her a thin dime. It could have cost her her life, and me mine. But it was a free tree. Christmas was on a Thursday that year, and 2 Saturdays before it, I was doing some chores for Mrs. Dowdle. She could round you up, cut you out of the herd, and throw a harness on you before you even knew it. She wasn't working Ruth Ann that Saturday because Ruth Ann was at church with Mother, rehearsing for the Christmas Eve concert. So was Phyllis. She had to be in the choir too, and she didn't like it, mainly because Ruth Ann had the solo. Anyway, it was in the middle of the Saturday morning, and I thought it was time for a break and maybe a slice of fruitcake. Mrs. Dowdle had baked a gross of them. We'd been working hard. She turned all the mattresses, aired the sheets, and beat the rugs. I'd had a raft of stuff to bring down from the attic. We were busy as bird dogs. In fact, we were up to something. Instead of the fruitcake, she said, "Go on out to the cob house and find that coil of rope. Bring the biggest saw." I should have seen what was coming right there. When I came out of the cob house, she was on her back porch, dressed in her full outdoor gear, flap cap, hunting jacket, 2 wash dresses, and an apron over a pair of men's pants, cotton stockings over her sleeves, and railroad gloves, gumboots. She was everything but armed. "Where's your pa?" she inquired, gazing elsewhere. I told her Dad was working at the food distribution center. All the same people we fed at Thanksgiving would be needing Christmas dinners. "Where's your car keys?" I stared up at her. Surely she didn't know how to drive a car. Except for Mrs. Weidenbach, the only old lady in town who drove was Miss Flora Schellebarger. She had a 1942 Packard Clipper, and she was all over the road with it. "Above the visor on the driver's side," I said. "Well, we'll naturally take the car," she said, businesslike. "How else are we going to get to the timber for a tree? Hoo boy, here comes Effie." Sure enough, here came Mrs. Wilcox across the yard in her usual rig, Mackinaw jacket, veiled hat, carpet slippers. But today she wore yarn mittens. She always knows when I'm going anywhere. I'd have to chloroform her and tie her down to get away without her. "I just happened to be passing by," Mrs. Wilcox sang out. She swerved off the road to open country. The 3 of us tramped across the yards to where the pickle was parked. A little pale morning sun had cleared the frost off the windshield and the first light snow of the season. None of this seemed quite right, but when I'd thrown the rope and the big 2-handled cross-cut saw into the trunk, they were both in the car already. Mrs. Wilcox was in the back and Mrs. Dowdle was in the front seat. But she wasn't behind the wheel. "I'll ride shotgun," she said when I opened the driver's side door. I couldn't see a moment ahead. She was hunkered down and staring straight out through the windshield. "You drive." "Mrs. Dowdle, I don't have a driver's license. I'm only..." "A license?" She could hardly believe her ears. "We're not going out on Route 36. We're just going on country roads." "But, and you're long enough in the leg," she observed. "You growed an inch and a half just this fall." "An inch and 5/8", I muttered. "Well, then, you'll reach the pedals, easy." I don't know how to drive, but my knee was on the seat. My hand closed over the steering wheel. I thought it'd be another 4 long years before I could drive. 3.5 to get a learner's permit. 42 months. I'd dreamed of that day, but it was a distant dream. "Well, you've watched your pa drive many a time," Mrs. Dowdle said. "If men can drive a car, how much can there be to it?" "Ooh, boy," Mrs. Wilcox said softly from behind. I was behind the wheel now. One hand gripped it. The other reached up for the keys. My heart was pounding like pistons. I adjusted the rearview mirror. I knew where the key went. I knew where the starter was. I knew you started in neutral. I hit the starter. In cold weather, the pickle was usually balky as a mule. It started right up, though, and roared. I watched my hand go for the gear shift. I yanked it into gear, maybe first gear. The pickle howled in pain. I jammed a sneaker down on the clutch and tried again. The pickle took a giant leap and then died. "Hold her," Mrs. Dowdle called out from up against the glove box. She's raring." Mrs. Wilcox disappeared completely from the rearview mirror. My heart was in my mouth, but my sneaker was on the clutch. I hit the starter, eased it into gear. By chance, my sneaker found the gas. We moved. Mrs. Wilcox reappeared in the mirror with her hat on sideways. The first leap had nearly taken out the grape arbor, but now I tried to steer because we were aimed at the back porch. The steering on a 1950 Nash is loose as a goose, and the hood's as big as an aircraft carrier. But we lumbered around the arbor and along the side of our house. We were still on private property, but the street was right there at the end of the hood. "Find the brake," Mrs. Dowdle mentioned. There were two of them, the handbrake and the pedal that wasn't the clutch. I used both. It skidded to a stop. My head hit the steering wheel and honked the horn. "Go left," Mrs. Dowdle advised. "We don't want to drive through town." I gave it a little gas and we leaped out into the snowy slab like a jackrabbit. Did I look both ways? But nothing was coming. We surged along in giant jerks. Mrs. Wilcox was all over the back seat. Another gear. Where was it? I remembered about the clutch. We whined into second. I was right. I was right there on the crown of the road. If we'd met anything coming at us, I would not be here to tell you about it. "Pick a side," Mrs. Dowdle said. I swerved to the ditch and back into the right lane. Mrs. Wilcox seemed to be holding on to the back door handle with both hands. Mrs. Dowdle rode shotgun with her knees wide and her boots planted. Open country unfolded ahead. I discovered third gear, and the whole day brightened. I went left when I was told, and I went right when I was told. Every turn took me on a big sweep across both lanes with the fender swooping out over the ditch. But we did make it. I was breathing pretty even now, even though my heart still hammered. It was like the first day of my life. We edged up to 30 miles an hour. The fences flickered past. Cattle out in the field stood broadside to the sun. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys. I still wasn't thinking ahead. I couldn't chance it. But there for a while in that straight stretch, I wasn't even a kid. I was 16. Since I couldn't see over the steering wheel, I had to see through it. Now a scary sight loomed ahead. A big bean truck was coming our way, taking more than his share. Mrs. Dowdle's shoulder came up, but she didn't say anything. "Whoo," said Mrs. Wilcox, and I shot off the road to give the bean truck all the room there was. But it was shoulder, not ditch. We threw gravel and bounced hard, but I got a swerve back and bumped back on the hard top. Now there was timber on both sides of us. We were coming up on a bridge over Salt Creek. I had to line up the wheels with the boards of the bridge, and I made it onto one of them. We clattered across into deeper timber. "Pull off where you see that track." I geared down for the turn. We made it between a pair of fence posts, but it was close. I listened for the sound of peeling chrome. It wasn't even a track for a while. It was just brush and snow in the ruts. When we were out of sight of the road, Mrs. Dowdle said, "Wheel around and pull up." I turned in the clearing, and the engine coughed, lunged, and then died. I was wringing wet and about as happy as I'd ever been. Mrs. Dowdle swung open the door and began to fight her way out. "Get the saw," she told me. Then she looked in the back seat. "You stay in the car, Effie. It's rough underfoot, and if you broke a leg, we'd have to shoot you." Through bare branches, we saw a stand of evergreens. I suppose Mrs. Dowdle knew exactly where they were. She tramped through the underbrush and fell over fallen logs. It was colder and quieter than the rest of the outdoors. Winter birds watched us from the high branches. Mrs. Dowdle stopped just to drink it all in. She always thought the town was too loud and crowded, but the 2 moons of her specs were already spotting for trees. She moved among them, looking over the long-needled pine and the blue spruce overlooking the scrawny ones. Then the saw was heavy in my hand. She took her time, but then she said, "There it is." It was a tall spruce, taller than we could use, but we could cut it down to the right length. She took one end of the saw and I took the other. In the last moment before we started, she listened to the silence, and then we began to saw. It was all I could do to keep up my end. She was like a buzzsaw herself. In no time at all, the tree began to topple, and she pushed the oozing trunk away. Between us, we began to drag it back to the pickle. Just at the edge of the clearing was about a 6-foot tree with a perfect cone shape. "That one do for your folks?" So we cut down that one, too. Mrs. Wilcox was all eyes from the back seat. Between us, we got both trees roped to the roof of the car. I wasn't a lot of help with that part, but Mrs. Dowdle could reach halfway across the top. I thought we were done, but she said, "We'll need some greens for wreaths." So back we trekked. She brought a folding knife. We worked farther into the trees, looking for the right branches, full and feathery. She cut and I carried. Then she went too far. She pushed past one of those last fir and dropped and stopped dead and staggered back. I almost walked up right on the back of her gumboots. There, ahead of us, freshly laid sod, was a brand new house, ranch style, with attached garage and a picture window, even a bird feeder. We were standing in somebody's backyard. Where in the Sam Hill did that come from? She wondered. You rarely saw her astonished, but she was. We thought we'd been out in the middle of nowhere. I heard voices, a door, a scrape of feet. She spun around and nearly knocked me flat. Run for your life! Don't drop the greens! We plunged, skimming the undergrowth, clearing logs. She had the saw. Gunfire behind us would have come as no surprise. Neither would snarling dogs. I ran like a blind boy with my face in the feathery greens. To this day, the smell of fir and pine brings back that morning. Back at the car, it was all a blur. Somehow the trunk lid was down, and Mrs. Dowdle and I were in the front seat, fighting for breath. Lay rubber, she said. Where's the fire? Mrs. Wilcox said. Then she vanished out of the rearview mirror because I found first gear with no trouble. The pickle rocketed down the track. I aimed between the fence posts and screeched out on the road on two wheels. Once again, if something had been coming, I wouldn't be telling this. We headed back the way we'd come, top heavy with trees. I was working through the gears like a pro now, and Mrs. Dowdle was wiping up under her specs with a blue bandana. Whoo boy, she said, busy, 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 and rushed off my feet. Not enough hours in the day. I'll die standing up like an old ox, Mrs. Wilcox said from behind. Did you see anything of the Dempseys? Who in tarnation are the Dempseys? Mrs. Dowdle asked. Why, they's the folks who bought up that whole tract of land, and they put that new house on it. My eyes were mostly on the road, but I noticed Mrs. Dowdle's fist clench on her knees. Many thanks for sharing that news, Effie, she said in a dangerous voice, and we drove on back to town. I did. Good chapter.